The Urbanist is brought to you in association with the Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is a beacon of hope and inspiration. A catalyst to spark growth and collaboration with museums and experiences, where art and science and nature and technology coexist.
The belief of Abu Dhabi that culture is the backbone of our society.
Stay tuned for a special episode of the show, in which you can hear His Excellency Mohammed Khalifa Al Mubarak explain exactly why and how Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is the perfect place to collaborate, create and innovate. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up.
There is this capacity that we have as humans, this switch that we have to change our emotional awareness to where we are so quickly. And I'm sure this is something that has evolved with us as humans over great spans of time.
We speak with the landscape architect behind one of New York's most exciting recent pieces of public realm as we delve into the story of Brooklyn Bridge Park and how it went from commercial concrete to a thing of natural beauty. Then we look to London to see what makes a location livable from youth through to adulthood and into old age too, by way of a recent survey on lifelong neighbourhoods. All of that coming up over the next 30 minutes, right here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck. Brooklyn Bridge Park is an 85-acre public space which sits on the Brooklyn side of New York's East River. The site was transformed from a once flat concrete industrial area to a truly living, breathing piece of public realm, giving residents a place to enjoy the fresh air, nature, and views of that Manhattan skyline. I was joined earlier by Michael van Valkenburg, the American landscape architect behind Brooklyn Bridge Park, as well as a new monograph of the same name. This publication tells the story of how the defunct commercial waterfront on the East River was transformed into an exemplar of adaptive reuse. I started by asking Michael to give us an idea of where this park sits within New York.
Brooklyn Bridge Park is on the waterfront. It's on the East River, and it spans a series of Brooklyn neighborhoods with sort of Brooklyn Heights. At the middle, it heads southward to Atlantic Avenue, where it ties into several other neighborhoods. And then to the north, it goes into what we call Dumbo and then connects up with Adams Street, which takes you right into downtown Brooklyn and a whole series of neighborhoods. So it's a real neighborhood collector park.
And the book that is the reason we're talking today shows these extraordinary photos of just the scale of the warehousing and the piers that were there before and how industrial they were and how you've transformed them. How did you get involved in this project?
So the advocacy for this park actually started in the 1980s with neighbors when it became clear that the port had to be abandoned. And that was because container shipping was transmogrifying how we move materials on water, and the East River is not deep enough for a container ship. And so this brand new waterfront pier that had just been built 30 years earlier was abandoned. The Port Authority was talking about building apartment buildings, like 1,200 units on the whole area, and the neighborhood started to say, let's have a park. So fast forward 15 years, they got organized in the late 90s to hire an economic planner, John Ausschuler from HR&A, to do an economic master plan to prove to the city and the state that it was possible. We were like the caboose on that project. It wasn't that it being a park was an afterthought in the late 90s, but it had to be defensible economically for the city and the state to support it. And then we provided some very preliminary ideas of what the park might look like. That was followed by an intensive public outreach process, hundreds of meetings with neighbors and people across the borough. as to what they wanted the park to be, which eventually resulted in an unusual partnership between the city and the state, who notoriously don't like each other, to build this park, but with the caveat that the maintenance of the park would be provided through income that was generated through the capture of tax revenue from future development at the edges. We started in 99 and the completion of the park was 23. So it was roughly a 25-year project for us.
And amazingly, in the book, you quite honestly say, look, often an architectural practice, a design agency will become involved in a project that begins to define who they are. And this is the project for you that has been so central to your life and your company's life. And you moved your offices from Manhattan to be here in Brooklyn. How much of your life has this taken up? You're running a company, but has this been much of the focus of your working life over those decades?
So, when things are good, there's kind of an infinite limit on how much life one has to give. Like if you're very passionate and doing something that's extraordinarily exciting. So I can't really put a measure on it quantitatively, but qualitatively, my family moved to Brooklyn, the office moved to Brooklyn. We got involved in this project that was, a 15-minute walk from the office. It gave us a remarkable and unusual opportunity to test ideas while design was going on, but then also during construction to be down there working with contractors, checking alignments of paths. This past weekend, we had a celebration of the Brooklyn Bridge Park book that Fiden has published, and we were on Pier 3, and I almost wanted to tell everybody that was there. I sort of wanted to say, well, when we were constructing this, we actually twisted right at the beginning of the installment of the stone, we kind of twisted the orientation of the terrace. So there was like this kind of magnificent embrace of one of the ends of the Brooklyn Bridge. So it's just, life defining. Like a lot of things define your life, but it's great when something as civic and as successful as this one does.
There's the linear part that goes along the whole riverfront, but then there's these piers, and on the piers there are sports fields, and there are areas of vegetation, and there are places to go out on a canoe. I was struck by, when I read the text and when I read your foreword, the kinds of words that came up: informal, frugal, meandering, spaces to get lost. When you began to think about this park as a piece of design, and as you said, you'd done all this outreach with the community, how did that then come to life? Because I presume you have to work with horticulturists and arborists and people who can plot and plan these spaces. Was it about those kinds of words and emotions that you wanted to bring to life in a physical space?
You kind of just wrap your arms around absolutely everything that it takes to make a great park. So I wasn't particularly young in the late 90s. I was in my late 40s. But having moved to New York and finally getting over the stigma of, how interested do we want to be in Frederick Law Olmsted? He was so 19th century. But somehow, as we were cresting into the 21st century, a lot of things that Olmsted was doing and talking about and understanding about the public realm and about being universally accessible to everyone made us realize that it's a little bit like a tire. If the park felt like it was in a tuxedo, it might be cool, but it might not be universally welcoming. And so the informality and maybe even the sense, we certainly wouldn't mind if when people are there, they're taken up with the experience and they might be, well, like maybe this was always here. Like maybe this wasn't a shipping pier in the 1950s. And then you walk out of that and you see, oh my goodness, there's like these fragments of industrial pieces that have been kept. So there's like a memory trace of recent history and kind of imaginary things. I say that people go to parks to have an escape in the city. I'm from the city. I don't think anybody who's in Brooklyn Bridge Park ever thinks that they're, up in the Catskills in a kayak. But, there is this capacity that we have as humans, this switch that we have to change our emotional awareness to where we are so quickly. And I'm sure this is something that has evolved with us as humans over great spans of time, that one of our things that makes us survivors is that we can move into a new environment and soak it in and feel comfortable in ways. And so we were after that. I don't know if you got to that page in the book, that cover of the New Yorker, where this guy is coming up out of a subway and he's in a kind of primordial jungle in New York City. And this cover of the New Yorker was in the early years of the 2000s, and it became our kind of anthem. We had it in the office on the wall that, you would go down Old Fulton Street or Atlantic Avenue, which are really seriously urban streets in Brooklyn, and then you would just be awash in landscape experience.
And just one other word that's a bit of a rallying cry as well is democratic. What does that mean when you create these spaces?
Oh, like the word we're all forgetting the meaning of right now in the world. Like just for everyone in the best sense, like a brand new parent with a squawky infant at 11 o'clock at night, or a bunch of teenage boys, of which I have a grandson, who, by the way, doesn't call it Brooklyn Bridge Park. They call it the Piers, but a place where teenagers of all kind of interest levels could feel welcomed. And, the whole thing about Pier 2, the temple of basketball, is to make the best place to play basketball in New York City. And it absolutely is. Like, it's such a cool place to be. And I know it's not good to refer to your own work as cool, so I apologize. But like the Nets players just show up there to like hang out with kids that are there playing basketball. And you're in this old warehouse building out in the middle of the East River with just the majesty of Manhattan across the way, and the harbor to your left, the 800-acre water sheet of the harbor. It's just a great place for young people to be.
The interesting thing is, that it's reconnected New Yorkers with the water in an interesting way, but water is friend and foe in New York, as in many cities. Just beyond Pier 6 is Red Hook, which we know about the floods and the terror that they brought. So tell us a little bit about how you've harnessed and made use and protected yourselves as well against that water.
Well, two quick stories. At our very first meeting, this revered legend in New York City, Mickey Murphy, who was one of the first women to be a headline front page writer, which sounds so ridiculous to even say, like, oh, that was a moment where women didn't write stories for the front pages of papers, but there was. And Mickey was at the meeting, and she was already in her 80s, and she went up to the microphone. First of all, the room silenced when she got up. Everybody knew who she was, and everybody quieted. And she went up to the microphone and said, I'm old and I'm retired and I don't have a lot of money anymore. And when this park is built, I want to go down to the East River alone at night and put my toes in the water of the East River and see the reflection of the moon. And, I have to tell you, I have goosebumps right now. I've probably told this story 100 times, but I remember her doing that. And it was one of those shifts of direction in intent when you're a designer. You're like, oh, people are not intimidated by the fact that this is an entirely paved, abandoned industrial waterfront. Like, they can see beyond that, and they want their Brooklyn to be, connected to the river. And it is an amazing thing that people wanted, and then we were able to do. But when Superstorm Sandy came, I think it was 2013, the park was inundated with 5 feet of salt water. And, we knew something like that was coming. This wasn't going to be like one of those deals like in Manhattan where they're putting up walls and creating all this separation between the city and the river. We were designing a park that would let the water in and then let the water out. And of course, this is something that nature has known how to do forever. The areas along harbors and rivers and ocean fronts periodically flood. And if you put in plants that can sustain the salinity that's in the soil, and if you're working with the kind of brilliant horticultural staff that run Brooklyn Bridge Park, they get the hoses out the next day, They start running fresh water through the soil. They wash out the salt, and you supersize some things. So if big logs and dead trees are floating about when the water comes in and they bang into, stuff in the park, it can survive it. But it was an incredible victory that storm happened and the park was open and running the next day. It's possible. And so it's another way of dealing with the impact of climate change.
Another thing, the urban setting, the expressway runs behind the park, past the piers. You have the Brooklyn Bridge there. What's the balancing act between acknowledging there's going to be traffic noise and letting the urban world in and wanting to lock it out as well? What's your process there?
Well, you're touching upon something extremely important about the context. In every landscape in the world, whether it's a garden or a park or a campus, borrows the landscape that's beyond. It's part of the scenery of your context, right? And so there was majesty and horror in this context, right? I mean, what's better than the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge landing in your park? What's better than the Empire stores and Manhattan across the way? But then there's this BQE, which is stacked up and generating this enormous, deafening highway noise that previously was being thrown across an industrial and noisy waterfront itself, and so it mattered less. But what you don't want when you go to a park is 85 decibels, which is very bad. It's like unhealthy, but also you have to yell to have a conversation. And so we constructed this sound berm out of earth to project the sound of the BQE obliquely into the air and then to send it high in the air up above the park where you don't hear it. And all the while that's going on, the sound waves, which are basically a form of energy, are dissipating and spreading apart, and which is to say the volume is reducing. And so by the time the sound falls back down to the level of the park, you're way out on the piers, and the decibel level is totally within the normal boundaries of what one expects in a city environment.
Michael, maybe as a final thought, of course, it's wonderful to have this handsome book about the park and its construction, but I wonder what you wanted the book to do, because it's beautiful. Do you want this to be a bit of a calling card, a rallying card for other people who are looking at post-industrial sites and what they can do with them? You're talking to us from a city that has helped define much of what the park is in life. What would you like this book to do?
I hope that this book will be a way for people in the future who might want to be involved in making a park on a complicated, urban, maybe distressed site to be inspired, not to in any way undersell how difficult a journey it is, and not to miss that we were blessed with a moment in time where New York City was coming back to its parks. It was after Betsy Barlow Rogers and many others revived Central Park, and then the same thing in Prospect Park. So people were back to thinking that parks were necessary and amazing. But it also happened at a moment where there was political alignment between just the everyday person and the electeds who were advocating. And so, I hope that the book is inspirational. It's a very thorough record of what was involved. I just want to say one thing in closing. I've been making parks since like 1989. I started my first park project in Columbus, Indiana. And I kind of been working on a park in one way or another since then. And it is amazing to me how few people kindle the beginning of the fire that eventually creates the breadth of support that's required for people to want to have it. And so I hope that one person or that couple of people somewhere in the world gets a hold of this book and it's like, see, I know our site looks impossible. Look how impossible this site looked, but look what they were able to do over time. So that's definitely one of our prime motivators for the book.
Michael van Valkenburg, the architect behind Brooklyn Bridge Park there, and thank you to him for joining us on The Urbanist. What makes a neighbourhood good for raising children? What about for first-time buyers or the elderly? And can one area be suitable for all stages of life? That was the subject of a recent survey commissioned by Jessica and Wiles and Taylor Wimpey, looking at lifelong livability and community building in London's suburbs. I was joined recently by Jude Harris, a director at Jessica and Wiles, to unpack a few of the findings, and I began by asking how the idea for the survey was born.
So we designed a new community, Greenwich Millennium Village, down in Greenwich, and we undertook a kind of slightly different form of post-occupancy evaluation. We decided to commission a film to understand how the residents that were living in the homes that we designed were finding kind of being in that community. And that gave us a real kind of human feedback to what it was that the residents were kind of feeling about living in Greenwich Millennium Village, and we were kind of keen to see if there was a way of also applying some kind of quantitative analysis to that as well. So we commissioned the survey to try and get a better understanding of what it is that defines a good neighbourhood, some of the design aspects that we develop, and so we thought we'd try and commission the survey, and so that went out to over 2,000 residents across the 33 London boroughs.
You tried to look across London, and you tried to find the things that did and didn't make people feel that they belonged to a community.
Yeah, what it is that makes people kind of enjoy living in London, what it is that defines a kind of lifelong community, what are the tenets of designing new spaces, new communities within London and indeed across the world that are kind of relevant to how we design the homes and the master plan that we developed at Greenwich Millennium Village, to try and make sure that those things that we'd developed initially for the competition winning proposals were being achieved in reality.
Let's talk about the survey. Tell me some of the kinds of things that you asked people as you began to try and work out whether there was a sense of community or not.
Yeah, so there were 5 set questions, and we asked people about some of these kind of quite emotive and qualitative things, like whether they enjoyed living in their community, whether they were happy with the facilities available in their community. And so they're all quite kind of ephemeral things, quite difficult to define, and actually quite different to the more kind of expressive and emotional response that we get when we kind of ask people in the video how they enjoyed living in their communities.
Some of the places that came out at the bottom of the rankings, which I have here, Bexley, Newham, Barking and Dagenham, why did they not have a sense of community? What was it that seemed to be absent in the answers that people gave? It's
difficult to define specifically. I don't think anybody was particularly surprised that maybe those boroughs came towards the bottom of the ranking. It was quite a small sample, but they are quite disparate boroughs with relatively low-grade housing stock, potentially, is one of the things that was being reflected in the survey. When we designed the new community in Greenwich, it was very much about providing kind of a variety of housing types, housing that would accommodate families. And so, understanding that kind of provision of housing and what it is that encourages people to live in an area, kind of catering for their needs from kind of, birth to kind of later living, really, was very much one of the characteristics that we had striven for in designing the Greenwich Millennium Village. And those boroughs potentially that came towards the lower of the rankings had less representative of those types of kind of communities and homes.
Because I'm struck also that many of these places also have some of London's poorer neighbourhoods as well. So that's why it becomes quite complicated, isn't it, to pick out the elements, but what's design and what's access, as you say, to services, and where services may be more strained because people's need to access them more. Did you find it quite hard to unpick that? Because, when I think about places where people talk about a sense of community, that many of the old kind of structures of working neighbourhoods where people felt very intimate have broken down because the nature of work has changed, the nature of families has changed, the way that schooling happens has changed. We're much more diverse and rich cultures in many ways, but that often means that you're more fractured in some instances. So it becomes quite hard to work out where community intersects with all these things, I guess.
Yeah, it is different, and I think every kind of London borough has that kind of diversity from poverty to wealth, and Greenwich has many of the kind of tenets of those boroughs that you've described. For us, it was about, we were creating a new community, a new village on the Greenwich Peninsula. That was one of the largest kind of brownfield rejuvenations, since the last Labour government in 1997. And so the community that's been created down there has very much been created in the last 20 years. So in creating that new community, we're trying to kind of tap into the things that we know to be successful in other parts of London and indeed other parts of the world. So it's about good transport links. It's about providing kind of affordable and variable types of homes. It's about providing kind of public open space with landscape, trees. At Greenwich Millennium Village, we're very fortunate to be able to enjoy the Ecology Park, which has a kind of lake, the public green, but also the river, which is a fantastic asset for our city. giving people a sense of kind of safety and security, so designing homes where there's that kind of natural passive surveillance and overlooking. And all of those things are the kind of the important and essential ingredients of creating a new community. And some of that is learning from the history of the London communities that exist. London is essentially a compilation of villages, and we were creating a new village in Greenwich.
So you've hinted at some of the things that you did to try and engineer community, and it's interesting that one of the things you reflect on there is the need to feel safe and secure where you are, and to have places where interaction with people you don't know can happen as well. So the public realm is, of course, super important. How has that worked across the time since you created that? Because you talk about community and village. If I went there, or if listeners went there, would they think, this is a village, this is a community? Is it palpable, or do you think that's more an emotive thing?
I would hope they would. I mean, it's taking time to build, and it's not finished yet. I mean, the first residents moved into the village about 8 years ago, so it's a building and evolving community. But we're about 75% through building the total number of homes for which we have approval for. It was first started by Ralph Erskine. It was his competition-winning design that kind of created the concept. He delivered phases 1 and 2, which provided about 1,000 homes, and our competition-winning design suggested a further 2,000 homes. So it's a 3,000 home community, and about 2,200 of those homes have been delivered. And it does have that sense of community. It has a primary school, it has a health centre, it has a village square, it has the Southern Park, which Erskine kind of designed to be big enough for that kind of traditional English sport of cricket, so it had a cricket pitch on it. And the ecology part was created to give that additional sense of kind of contact with nature and the river. So the infrastructure, which is so important to making these communities a success, was very much put in place as part of the work that was done by the Millennium Communities competition initially, and the initial phases of the Ralph Erskine work on the peninsula early on. And we were able to kind of build on that and benefit from that infrastructure being in place. So certainly when I go there now, it does have that sense of community and that sense of village life, as it were. It's got the views out. It does have a sense of kind of safety and security. It has a variable population with different kind of cultural backgrounds, different age profiles, has a community centre, has a nursery, which we've created in some of the later phases. And so it does have all of those things that you would expect to find in a successful and supportive community for residents.
You looked at something which is also quite fascinating, because I wonder how often even people think about this anymore, about creating lifelong communities, places where maybe you'll move to different housing stock, but you'll stay in a neighbourhood for a long time. Is that still relevant in London? Do you think that people do think about a lifelong commitment to a place? Because it feels that people are so itinerant these days, and the nature of lives and the way that we flex our lives is so much more, just so different from the past. I wonder how many people think about lifelong communities.
I hope that London continues to be a city that can support lifelong communities if that's what people want to do. And as you say, we're much more transient. As people, we move around the city, around the country, around the world much more than people used to. But I think it's important that a community is able to cater for those range of needs, be it to do with kind of affordability, be it to do with kind of needs of particular kind of demographics, be it to deal with, particular employment needs. I think it's really important for a city to thrive that it is able to accommodate that kind of full range of lifestyles and different types of homes and communities that are necessary to make a rich and successfully cohesive city. Absolutely.
How will you use this information going forwards, and do you think this is the kind of work that other developers and other builders should be using as they begin to think, okay, before we put spade in ground, how will this actually show itself as a community, not just a collection of buildings?
We wanted to kind of get some feedback from the residents to understand that kind of human and emotive response to how they found living there. And we were very conscious that that potentially needed to be supported with an element of kind of quantitative data. But happiness is a very kind of difficult thing to define quantitatively. There's an author, I think it's Paul Dolan, who talks about happiness, and he's an economist and he wants to be able to kind of put numbers on it and to be able to kind of assess it year on year so that happiness can be measured. And, there's the joyous side of happiness, which is an emotive response. But also he talks, I think, about the kind of purposeful sense of happiness and how you're getting a sense of purpose out of the activities that you're doing that make you happy, that contribute to those emotions. And we're kind of playing to those kind of ephemeral things, really, and trying to understand what it is that people like about living in the homes that we've designed, what they like about the spaces that we created in the master plan at Greenwich Millennium Village, what it is that makes the community of Greenwich Millennium Village a nice place for them to live. So the more kind of emotive and ephemeral things, but we attempted to kind of apply a quantitative element to that. And I think, as you observed, it's not been entirely conclusive. It's a fairly small sample that we've worked with, and it's quite a kind of a non-specific thing to seek quantitative data.
Interesting that you did it in the first place, because most people, the designing or the building of these communities happens at such a pace. Do you think this will continue to inform the work that you're doing now then? Have there been takeaways that, as a practice, you're thinking, okay, this is something we need to reflect on more? Or
I think we got much more positive takeaways from the kind of the qualitative work that we did. So the video that we commissioned and the direct feedback that we got from residents, I think was much more confirming of some of the design principles that we developed. The quantitative responses were perhaps less obvious. And so I think if we were to do the survey again, we've learned from it. It was an experiment. And I think we would potentially do it differently to try and get more of a kind of quantitative assessment. But the qualitative assessment has been compelling and very kind of rewarding in terms of the positive feedback that we've got from residents about what it is they believe are the qualities of the spaces that we've designed.
Jude Harris from Jessica and Wiles, my thanks for joining me. Well, that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember, you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider, and you can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced by Carlotta Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.